So good afternoon and welcome to the work group meeting for the Inhalables, Artificially Derived Cannabinoids, and Concentration Limits work group. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend this afternoon's meeting. We appreciate all of your commitment in helping us in this effort. My name is Madeline Kane and I am the Policy Coordinator for the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's meeting is being recorded, so please be aware of whether or not your phone is muted. I will be tech support today and muting all to keep the noise down. This means I will mute all periodically to make sure there isn't any competing noise. Don't take this personally. The work group members are asked to remain on mute until the introductions portion of the meeting. I will also be the timekeeper. We have a lot to get through today, so I may have to cut off conversations to be sure we get to other issues, but I will try to give everyone a 5-minute warning. Only invited workgroup members will be a part of today's conversation. Members were selected due to their level of interest or position in the community. If you are not an invited member or proxy, please use the call-in number that was transmitted in the notice for this workgroup meeting. With that in mind, I ask that each of you serve as a goodwill ambassador to the discussion so that you may represent your constituency professionally. The purpose of this meeting is to collect general feedback. We do not expect every member of this work group to be an expert on every topic that we will be discussing today. As such, we are hoping that participants refrain from detailed and nuanced discussions and follow up with us later with specific questions. Non-work group members will be able to tender comments during either the public hearings or during the comment periods, which will be held for the different rule packages in which these concepts and issues will appear. Work group members, please state your first and last name each time you make a comment. So let's get started. Today is Tuesday, August 24th, 2021 at approximately 2:00 p.m. The OLCC is undertaking an effort to draft and amend rules relating to legislative changes and emerging products. The OLCC has compiled this work group to discuss issues relating to inhalables, artificially derived cannabinoids, and concentration and sales limits. The purpose of this work group is to gather feedback from stakeholders and experts prior to drafting the rules. As such, the work group is comprised of licensees, permittees, industry representatives, OLCC staff, members of law enforcement, local government, the public, local community organizations, small businesses, and other interested stakeholders. The purpose of having all the members in this work group is to hear from different parts of the industry and our public health and safety partners prior to a drafting administrative rule. During this afternoon's meeting, we will seek your input on concepts and issues related to inhalables, artificially derived cannabinoids, and concentration limits. Many of you are familiar with our agency's rulemaking process. While this meeting is formatted similarly to a Rules Advisory Committee meeting, the goal of this meeting will be different. Today we will not be collecting your thoughts on proposed rules, but rather collecting ideas on how we should draft the rules. The feedback we get on today's topics will inform the language of the draft rules, which will be included in separate rule packages. Following today's meeting, we will continue the rulemaking process for multiple previously initiated rule packages. Each of these rule packages may contain concepts that we are discussing here today. For each of these rule packages, we will designate a Rules Advisory Committee meeting, hold a public hearing, and open a public comment period, so there will be many opportunities to contribute. The Rules Advisory Committee meetings will be the arena in which we talk in detail about the proposed rules. Today's meeting will be more about collecting general feedback. Under Oregon's public meeting law, this meeting is open to the public and members of the public are free to observe our discussion, but may not offer comments. The agency will digitally record this work group meeting and will produce and circulate a record of our discussion. However, because this meeting is intended to promote the open exchange of ideas, we will maintain an informal atmosphere and meeting minutes will record only the topics discussed and the main points made. Approximately 1 week after our meeting, we will post and distribute the meeting's audio. We understand there's a lot of discussion about these topics, so before we delve into the concept, does anyone have any procedural questions? Okay. Then we will go ahead and jump into introductions. I will be calling on you to introduce yourself, so go ahead and unmute when I call your name. When you do introduce yourself, will you please state your first and last name and the organization you're representing or your affiliation with the industry? So I'm just going to go across the rows. Amanda Borup.
Hi, I'm Amanda Borup. I'm a policy analyst with the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission.
Thanks, Amanda. David Standiford.
I am David Standiford, compliance specialist with the OLCC.
Thanks, David. Emily Roque.
Hi, I'm Emily Roque. I work for the ODA as the hemp testing specialist.
Emily. Stephen Crowley.
Hi, I'm Stephen Crowley. I'm the hemp and processing specialist here at OLCC.
Thanks, Stephen. JT.
Hi, I'm John Thompson, go by JT, owner and operator of Sublime Solutions, and we hold both processing and wholesale licenses.
Rich Evans. He may have stepped away.
Yeah, funny. Well, Rich Evans, OLCC, licensing and compliance.
Courtney Moran.
Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney Moran. I am the president and lobbyist for the Oregon Industrial Hemp Farmers Association.
Sunny Summers.
Good afternoon. I'm Sunny Summers. I'm the Cannabis Policy Coordinator for the Oregon Department of Agriculture.
Sunny. TJ Sheehy. Oh, TJ, we can't hear you. Still can't hear you. We'll come back. Will Hegland.
Will's microphone does not work.
Try. Can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you.
Now can you hear me?
Brief, like a little bit. Okay. Margaret Flerschinger.
Hi, Margaret Flerschinger with the Oregon Health Authority Medical Marijuana Program Policy Analyst.
Hi, Margaret. Anthony Galtoski.
Anthony Galtoski, Policy Analyst for the OLCC.
Mitra Sticklin.
My name is Mitra Sticklin, and I'm with Ohm Extracts. We're an OLCC processor and an ODA hemp handler.
Travis Ruthenberg.
Hi, Travis Ruthenberg. I'm the Senior Vice President of Research and Development for SC Laboratories. We're a testing lab for cannabis and hemp.
Thanks, Travis. Stephen Jetter.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Jetter. I am with Orlap, Orlap Assessor.
Thanks. Rosa Casares.
Hi, my name is Rosa Cazares. I'm the CEO of Lamota. We're a vertically integrated cannabis company.
Thanks, Rosa. Kim London.
Hey everyone, Kim London. I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Cannabis Association, trade association representing licenses all around the state from every license type.
Thanks, Kim. Dylan Summers.
There, Dylan Summers, co-founder at Lazarus Naturals, vertically integrated hemp product manufacturer in Oregon, and the president of the Association of Western Hemp Professionals.
Thanks. Anna Simmons.
Hi, I'm Anna Simons. I'm with East Fork Cultivars. We have producer licenses both on the OLCC side and ODA for craft hemp.
Ty Riley.
Hey everyone, Ty Riley here with the Mr. Nice Guy stores.
Brad Douglas.
Good afternoon, everyone. Brad Douglas here. I am a organic and medicinal chemist, and I handle regulatory affairs for the workshop.
Kelly Rout.
Good afternoon, Kelly Rout with the Administrative Hearings Division at OLCC.
Bonnie Jo Peters. Bonnie, can you hear us? we'll come back to you. Robin McKay? Oh, okay. Annie Rothrock.
I think that might be me. So,
Oh, I'm sorry.
that's okay.
Okay. Annie Rothrock?
Hi, Annie Rothrock with Northwest Confections, doing business as Wild. We're a hemp handler and cannabis processor.
Holly Hucko.
Hi there, Holly Huckel here with Elevate Holdings. We hold processor, wholesale, and producer licenses.
Sean McKay. If you're talking, Sean, we can't hear you.
Hello, Sean McKay. Can you hear now?
Yes.
Hello?
Yep.
No?
We can hear you.
Yes?
Yep.
Sean McKay, owner and operations manager for Burnt River Farms in Eastern Oregon.
Casey Houlihan. Casey, are you speaking? We can't hear you.
Oh, we can hear you.
We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh,
We can hear
sorry,
you.
just me.
Great. All right. Yeah, Sean McKay, owner and operations manager for Burnt River Farms, located in Eastern Oregon.
Okay, Casey Houlihan.
Good afternoon, Casey Houlihan. I'm the executive director of the Oregon Retailers of Cannabis Association. I'm here on behalf of Jesse Bonacue.
Thanks, Casey. Christine Smith.
Hi guys, Christine. Christine Smith here from the Groon companies. We're a hemp handler and edible processor.
Tim Fitzpatrick. Tim, we can't hear you. Still no. Still can't hear you. We'll circle back and hopefully by then we'll be able to hear you. Antonio Harvey?
Patrick with Cureleaf.
Oh, there you go.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Antonio Harvey.
Antonio Harvey, Director of Operations and co-owner for Harmony Roots. We're a producer here in Oregon.
And Nathan Ricks.
Good afternoon, Nathan Ricks with the Liquor and Cannabis Commission.
And then TJ, do you want to see if your audio is working now?
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Bluetooth configuration. Hi, TJ Sheehy, Director of Analytics and Research with the OLCC.
Thanks, TJ. And then I think we're still looking, Bonnie Joe or Robin, can you hear us or introduce yourself? Okay. All right. Okay, so thank you all for attending. Stephen Crowley will
This
now...
is Robin McKay. Can you hear me?
There you go. Yep.
I'm with Burnt River Farms. We're a vertically integrated cannabis company.
Thanks, Robin. Okay. So again, thanks for attending. I'm going to pass it over to Stephen Crowley now, who is going to provide some background on these topics.
Thanks, Madeline. So first, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to participate today. As Madeline said, we're here to discuss concepts that will inform ongoing rulemaking. During this past legislative session, legislators only passed a handful of bills that impact cannabis regulation here at OLCC, but some of the bills that passed are very substantial, and we want to make sure we're thoughtful and deliberate about implementing them. A quick note on terminology. We're going to be talking a lot about all kinds of cannabis today. I understand that the term marijuana comes with a fraught history, but the law divides cannabis into two categories, hemp and marijuana, and provides that they be regulated differently. So in framing these discussions, I'll use the terms hemp and marijuana when I'm referring to one of them specifically, and the term cannabis when referring to the plant generically. To make the best use of our time today, I've identified several specific problems or questions that we'd like to get feedback on. For each of these, I'll give some background on the issue and some of the information and principles that should help guide a solution, and then open it up for feedback. As Madeline said, we have a lot of material to get through today, so we want to be mindful of the time, but we also want to make sure each of you have the opportunity to weigh in on the areas that are most important to you or on which you have the most expertise. This will not be the only opportunity to provide feedback. We will hold rule advisory committees to consider specific language related to the concepts that we discussed today. And then each rule package will also have a public hearing and a public comment period. And if we get to the end of the day and you realize there's a big piece that was missed, you can always reach out to let us know. Final bit of housekeeping. This work group is scheduled for 3 hours, and I suspect that we will use all of that time. So around the halfway point, we'll plan to take a 5-minute break to give everyone a chance to get away from their screens and stretch for a minute. So all that being said, let's dive into the first item on the agenda. The first main category that we'll tackle is concentration and serving size limits. And we will talk about adult use and medical marijuana serving size limits, hemp items, serving size limits for sale to minors, and general hemp serving size limits. But the first piece that we'll tackle is the marijuana serving size limits. So House Bill 408, Section 16, and House Bill 3000, Section 11A, transfer the authority to set marijuana serving size and concentration limits from OHA to OLCC. These changes also allow OLCC to place limits on adult use cannabinoids and artificially derived cannabinoids. We'll tackle those issues later in this work group, but for now, let's just focus on the Delta 9 THC limits. The legislation requires that our rules must allow for a concentration of up to 100 milligrams of THC per package of cannabinoid edibles. We have heard a lot of questions about timing for establishing new edible lines with up to 100 milligrams of THC. And so I'll pass it to Anthony Geltowski for a minute to talk about what the label approval side of that process looks like.
Thank you, Stephen. This is Anthony Geltowski, OLCC for the record. Just really briefly, as Stephen mentioned, we can now increase the edible servings or container limit to 100 milligrams of THC. These changes on the label will require resubmission and pre-approval. The labeling rules do not allow these changes to be made without resubmission and pre-approval. The rules will not likely become operative until January 1st of 2022. OLCC cannot approve labels that violate the rules. So that, long story short, is these labels cannot be approved until January 1st of 2022. However, I will absolutely work with licensees as soon as they are ready to get their labels uploaded to the portal. That way, as soon as the rules become operative, I can start approving these labels and they can be compliantly used. Any questions related to this can be sent to marijuana.packaging@oregon.gov. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Anthony. And so, since Oregon already has established serving size and concentration limits, those are kind of the starting point for this discussion. We're currently thinking about largely adopting OHA's limits as is, with just a few changes. One being in accordance with the new statutory language, increasing the adult use edible limit from 50 milligrams per package to 100 milligrams per package. And then we're also considering changing the limits for adult use transdermal patches, which are currently subject to the same limits as adult use edibles. Is there any feedback from the group on those two changes, or are there other limits that members of the work group think OLCC should consider changing?
Annie Rothrock with Northwest Confections. We strongly support a 10 milligram serving size for the edibles to conform with the rest of the states on the West Coast and the general norm now for the marijuana industry.
Is there any talk of increasing flower purchase limits?
So that's not one of the subjects that we're looking at today. We're just looking at the concentration and serving size limits. But I think there is a different rule package that we'll be looking at the retailer daily sale limits.
Hey, this is Christine with Gruen, and I agree with Annie on that. If they're the 100 milligram is great, the 10 milligram with 10 piece really goes a far way, I think, for the industry in general to be able to keep the integrity of the products that we're bringing to market. Trying to take these into 20 serving sizes at 5 milligrams becomes more complicated. And really isn't in line with what we're seeing across the nation right now in recreational markets. But that's my two.
Margaret Florshinger, could you speak to what that means for medical products also?
I'm sorry, I missed that. For which products?
For medical, if the edible limits for recreational are increased to 100 milligrams, does that do anything for medical, or do medical patients still only get 100 milligrams?
So that is a Steve Crowley with OLCC for the record. So that's a good question. The language in the statute says that we can establish edible limits up to 100 milligrams per package. So it's not entirely clear to us at this point whether we have the ability to go above that 100 milligram limit. So that's something that we will need to look at.
JT from Sublime Solutions. Stephen, does this also run over into issues surrounding hemp edibles out in the marketplace, not necessarily in OLCC with the 0.3% problem that can occur?
Yes, we'll get to that in a little bit here. We'll tackle the marijuana limits and then the hemp for sale to minor limits and then the hemp for sale to adult limits.
This is Mitra Sticklin with Extract. I think that the change to 100 milligram edibles for recreational sales is a great idea, and as other members have mentioned, is more in line with other states and will still be very safe for consumers. One separate but related limit that we often get requests for is for recreational packages for extracts to be up to like a 3 gram size rather than a 1 gram, which would equate to basically up to 3,000 milligrams of THC versus the current 1,000 milligrams of THC. Since the OLCC also oversees, all the alcohol sales in the state, I'd just like to point out that these kind of limits are not applicable to like alcohol, and that I believe that the risk is much lower for marijuana versus alcohol. So with all of the same requirements around daily limits for extract, but just to allow for more efficient packaging so that a customer who wanted to get a full, 3 grams rather than 1 gram of extract wouldn't need to buy 3 separate packages with all of the you know, the extra plastic and environmental footprint associated. Thank you.
Thanks, Mitra.
Annie Rothrop, again with Wild. Oh, just to piggyback on what she was saying, if we did 5 milligram doses of our gummies and had to do 20 servings, that would increase the packaging size and again be extra plastic out in the market. That would be unnecessary if we could do the 10 milligram serving sizes.
Yeah, Christine here with Gruen. Just tackling onto that, I mean, I think generally what the industry is generally on board with the 100 milligrams, and I think we can get there. The bigger thing that with all of us companies that are operating on a pretty significant pace right now is the timing of how this is going to roll out, so that we're able to look ahead and prepare for packaging and for production and what we're doing. So getting an idea of, sure, if we're going to see approvals for packaging and that's going to be available January 1st, or what that looks like, when these rules are in effect, are going to, in theory, take effect, if that's April 1st or February 1st, or what that timeline looks like, so that we can limit the amount of waste that we're seeing, as our current products are going to basically sort of become obsolete in some ways as we transition to the 100 milligrams. And for a lot of that's our entire product line is going to transition overnight, and it's a lot of logistics to kind of manage, and really that's what I need to know is what kind of timeline we're looking at, because we're buying packages in the hundreds of thousands. I know Wild and a lot of other people are too, so we just need to prepare for that.
100%. Oh, Annie Rothrop with Wild. 100% agree with Christine. We order 6 months worth of packaging out. We've got a lot of operational details to get under control before we can roll this out. And then also, if perhaps there could be a sell down time period for the older 5 milligram SKUs. There's also control studies that we have to consider for our testing. It's going to be a big lift, but we're excited.
Yeah, is there a possibility for control studies to happen before, sorry, Christine again, before the end of the year, or do we need to wait for the rules to be codified or whatever that, at the end of the year before we can even begin control studies?
David, do you want to take that?
Sure. David Stanford, OLCC. Certainly you can be getting control studies for medical grade at the 100 milligram level. I don't necessarily see a concern with you repackaging those items once you have label approval to the recreational items. So for specifically for edibles in this one scenario, I could imagine that working, though I would have to confirm that with OHA and double check the rules, but that's how I would see that piece. I will say the control study rule is likely going to be under revision this year in some future racks held by OHA. So likely a lot to be changing with that and how those look moving into next year.
Travis Ruthenberg, SC Laboratories. I agree with the previous commenters that this would be a great alignment to other states in the industry with little downside.
This is Kim London, Oregon Cannabis Association. Yeah, I agreed with the comments made so far. As one of the folks who got pushed for this increase, but also want to reiterate the importance of needing a runway for folks in production to plan their operating procedures and get their businesses in line with the new rules. I wanted to just circle back on the labeling question, because to me it sounds like then there's no way this could be implemented by the 1st. So I'm curious if you could explain a little bit more, like why we couldn't get pre-approval for the labeling, and what do you think the timeline will be if it has to be the 1st when everyone asks for approval for those labels?
Hi, Anthony Galtoski, OLCC for the record. So just to be clear, I cannot pre-approve any of the labels that violate the current rules. So any label that says 100 milligrams of THC, I simply can't approve it until the rules become operative. And these rules will likely become operative January 1st of 2022. So what I'm offering to do is work with licensees via email to have them submit their labels to me. We can go over them, make sure they're all ready, and then, you know, in December they can have their label applications unlocked and they can upload those files to the label application. That way, January 1st, I can begin to start approving those labels as soon as the rules become operative. Does that make sense? Does that help, Ken?
What are you going to work on? Well, go ahead, Christine.
That help. Yeah.
TBD.
How much faith can we have that we can move forward with accuracy? Well, I guess we can't. Then we still can't move forward with any approvals or ordering on packaging until that's complete, because we won't have approval then.
Yes, Anthony Galtoski once again. Yes, Christine, licensees always run the risk of ordering the supplies before the label is actually approved, and I always encourage licensees to make that order once it shows approved in the system.
Okay, that just leads us back to the timeline of when, yeah, the larger question of timeline for rolling this out, probably.
Yeah, to that point, Casey Houlihan here with the Oregon Retailers of Cannabis Association. I wanted to echo the comments that Kim mentioned as well as it relates to making sure that we're being sensitive about thinking about how this timeline will work for the ramp up. And I would also like to include that I think it would be in everyone's best interest if we also included some kind of explicit sell down period for previous inventory that could overlap so that businesses are able to still continuously sell their product during that period of time. But some type of ramp up towards the new labeling requirements as well as a sell down for the previous product and inventory already.
Steve Crowley, OLCC. So just to be clear, there won't be any need for a sell down because 50 milligram edibles will be able to continue to be sold as the 100 milligram limit takes effect. So it'll be a probably transition period for the market, but no explicit sell down will be needed. I think we've heard a lot of good feedback there. Just in the interest of time, I'd like to move on to the next concentration and serving size limit topic, though, which is sale of hemp items, cannabinoid hemp items to minors. So House Bill 3000 sections 1 and 4 prohibit the sale of adult use cannabis items to minors and give OLCC the responsibility to establish the threshold of THC and adult use cannabinoids that are allowed in a hemp item before it qualifies as an adult use cannabis item. So we have implemented this by adopting OAR 845-026-0300 as a temporary rule, which basically sets up a few key parameters. So no more than 0.5 milligram of THCs or THCAs or other cannabinoids advertised as having an intoxicating effect, no artificially derived cannabinoids, and the products have to be tested with sufficient sensitivity to show that they have less than that 0.5 milligram of delta-9 THC. As we go through permanent rulemaking on these, we would like feedback on any adjustments that may be needed. For context, none of this applies to hemp grain and fiber products that don't contain cannabinoids. These limits only pertain to cannabinoid hemp items. And so we've heard some questions about whether the 0.5 milligram limit should be per serving instead of per unit of sale. The challenge that we see there is that a manufacturer can make a serving size trivially small. So for example, someone could make a 10 serving gummy or a 10 serving caramel that contains 0.5 milligram per serving, but really it's a gummy or a caramel that contains 5 milligrams of THC and then package that for sale. So really, whether the limit's per package or per serving with a specific number of servings allowed in a package, the ultimate question at the bottom of it is how much THC should a minor be allowed to purchase? And then the other area that we'd like feedback on specifically is how to address hemp cannabinoid topical or cosmetic type products. There doesn't seem to be a need to worry about people eating soap or drinking shampoo, but there are questions about how to handle, say, a food grade massage oil that's infused with hemp cannabinoids, or lip balms where a consumer gradually ingests the cannabinoids as they lick their lips. So any feedback on those two areas, how much THC should minors be able to purchase, and any feedback on how to thread the needle of cosmetic products.
As a curious question, what's the limit? What's the federal limit on the amount of THC a minor can ingest right now?
So right now in other states, the only limit is 0.3% THC by weight. So what that means is that a 20 gram item, a packet of gummies, could contain 60 milligrams of THC, or we've seen some items that are 20 milligrams per caramel of THC, and because these are all hemp and they're below that 0.3% threshold, those are all legal for sale to minors in most states, which is one of the issues that the Oregon legislature tried to tackle by creating this category.
Thank you.
It's JT with Sublime Solutions. I personally would be in favor of having the limits be done per packet or per full unit of sale, as opposed to, per divided portion of that. Otherwise, as you pointed out, Stephen, you're just going to run into the same thing with bad actors making these large products that end up, easily in the hands of kids in particular, and being able to get blasted. So that would be my suggestion.
Like 2.5, 3, something like that is reasonable. As far as the comments about Delta 8, from my understanding, nobody is really able to actually grow the amounts that you would need to actually extract, to have like fully extracted Delta 8 products. It occurs in such tiny amounts, and maybe there are some breeders I don't know about who are maybe getting there, but really it seems like pretty much everyone is synthesizing it at this point.
Steve Crowley, OLCC, yeah, so the way that the current rule operates, it does have a 0.5 milligram threshold for any THC, so that applies to Delta 8 also. I think it's generally safe to assume that if there's that much Delta 8 in a product, it's probably artificially derived, but that makes it easier than having to demonstrate that. So the artificially derived piece there really catches more things like the THC, acetates, and hexahydrocannabinol, and other ones that you wouldn't expect to occur in the plant.
David Stanford, OLCC. So I've heard 2.5 milligrams may be the limit where we suspect people are feeling a physiological effect from it. Do you believe that should be the limit, or, knowing as we've all been minors before, if I know 2.5 is the limit, I'll just buy 5 of them or 10 of them or something like that? So should the limit be below that physiological limit, so as to discourage people from just stacking sales to try and get to a point where you're getting high?
Well,
Travis Ruthenberg. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Travis. I mean, I would say, well, we card people for kombucha, but are kids buying, 10 of those to try and get drunk? I suspect not. And I know that might be a little apples and oranges, but what I would also remind us is that craft products that are full spectrum will have naturally occurring THC, and many of us believe that those are higher quality products when they're less processed and just extracted directly from the plant source in the naturally occurring ratios, so which can yield a few milligrams of cannabinoids. So if we push that limit down, we're going to require extra processing. We're going to, I think, force people to have product quality that is not to their liking in terms of how natural or how minimally processed the therapeutic effects that you get from the full spectrum plant. So I would say, honestly, I would disagree that stacking products should be a major concern, but others may disagree with me.
Thanks, Anna. Anna, could you say your name for the record just so we have it?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Anna Simons.
Steve Crowley, OLCC. So just to be clear on the scope of what we're talking about here, this is just for products that minors would be able to purchase. We'll talk about the sale to adults next, but are you advocating that minors should be able to purchase the larger amounts of THC that occur in these full spectrum products? And if so, is there a way to thread that needle where, I know a full spectrum product is going to have some amount of THC, but if the limit is just 2.5 milligrams of THC, that would treat a full spectrum product that has 100 milligrams of CBD and 2.5 milligrams of THC just the same as a small single serve gummy that has 2.5 milligrams of extracted THC.
Anna Simons responding, wouldn't these products still be subject to the percentage limit as well? So, because if you have a product with 100 milligrams of CBD and 2.5 milligrams of THC, the CBD is really going to offset any or the majority of the effects from THC.
Right, but the 0.3% is a very large limit for edibles. So yes, it's subject to 0.3% THC, but that's the problem that we're trying to address here, is that allows the purchase of very impairing products derived from hemp.
I'm certainly not advocating that minors have free access to THC, but I do think that like you said, we should thread the needle for businesses who produce, high quality, full spectrum, artisanal products from the plant that complies with the Farm Bill. And I would say, I think per package, if you set really small limits, then we might get into that extra packaging issue as well.
This is TJ from Ohm Extracts, and I agree with the point that Anna is making about the potentially inebriating effects of THC when they're taken with large amounts of CBD. It's actually much less inebriating than, for example, if there were a product with 0.3% THC and 0% CBD. So perhaps rather than an overall cap on how many milligrams in a package, we could keep the 0.3% and then set something more like a ratio minimal, so that that there's going to be 20-to-1 CBD to THC or 25-to-1 CBD to THC, something like that. The science and anecdotally seems to point to when there are these higher ratios of CBD to THC, the inebriating effects and potential of the THC is greatly reduced to a minimal amount. So I would advocate for keeping the 0.3%, not having an overall milligram limit, but rather having like a ratio so that you know that a manufacturer wouldn't be able to, for example, put no CBD at all in a hemp package, but only put the 0.3% THC, which would indeed be much more inebriating, for example. Thank you.
This is TJ with OLCC. Just to go back to what Anna was saying, just a follow-up question. So Anna, you're talking about a certain class of products. I guess, what types of products are we talking about that would be marketed for use by minors under 21? Because again, to Stephen's point, we're sort of bifurcating this discussion, one for under 21, one for over 21. So I understand your argument in the context of over 21-year-olds, but I guess my question would be, what types of products are we talking about that would be marketed to or for kids that would be excluded by the status quo limit of 0.5 milligrams?
From my understanding, the products that typically run up against the by dry weight percentage issue are typically more like edible or tincture type products. And I am talking about on the hemp side. But I do want to clarify that we certainly don't, and I don't know of anyone marketing or creating products for minors. It's just that CBD and hemp derived products are very useful and very therapeutic for a lot of different people, and are used by people of all ages. We hear stories all the time, and part of the efficacy of these products is because of their full plant formulations. So it's really, I don't know if I have a definitive answer of, is what is the best way to do this, but I really would like to see the ability to do a full spectrum extract protected.
And this is Mitra Sticklin again with extracts. Stephen, you bring up a good point about the differentiation between the different product types, and perhaps that is a good way to look at what may be dangerous to minors in terms of how someone's consuming the products. Like, for example, I don't believe that anyone would want minors to be able to access any kind of vape products, really, like hemp vape products included, or smokable items. But when it comes to products that are not inhaled into the lungs, that, to me seems like more complex, but perhaps also just having some rules around product types that may be accessible to minors, and specifically around vapes, just the way that they can't access nicotine vapes before age 18. Although this is a different age limit, same kind of idea may apply with inhalables, for example.
Thanks, Mitra, and thanks everyone. This has been helpful. I think, again, in the interest of time, let's jump to the next topic, which we've already kind of started talking about, which is limits for hemp items for sale to adults outside of the OLCC system. So House Bill 3000, Sections 6 and 17, direct OLCC to establish serving size and concentration limits for THC and other cannabinoids in hemp. Any item exceeding those limits could only be sold at an OLCC licensed marijuana retailer. So the objective here is to close the loophole where hemp items, and especially edibles, can have much more Delta-9 THC than marijuana items are allowed to have. And I mean, we've seen some of those types of products hitting the market where it's hemp-derived THC, Delta-9 THC, in 10 or 20 milligram serving sizes, sold in a 40-pack. And so also another piece of context, while House Bill 3000 technically gives OLCC authority to limit other cannabinoids as well, We intend to defer to the task force that was established by House Bill 3000 to tackle the issue of naturally occurring cannabinoids that are extracted from hemp. So for now, we're just talking about the Delta 9 THC limits, and we'll talk about the artificially derived cannabinoids a bit later here. But for right now, what we're wanting feedback on is Delta 9 THC limits in hemp items that can be sold at CBD stores and grocery stores and convenience stores. And so the main questions are, one, should adult use hemp items be sold in the general marketplace? And if so, how much THC should they be allowed to contain? And yes, I'll leave it there and open it up for feedback.
My opinion, this is Antonio Harley. My opinion would be that if it's legal at a federal level, you should regulate it like everything else that's legal at the federal level, versus normal or plant-derived THC, which is currently illegal at the federal level. We have to regulate it differently within the state. So rather than fight the feds, why not just go along with their regulations here within the state the way you do alcohol?
Thanks, Antonio. Steve Crowley, OLCC. So just to clarify, you're okay with edibles at a convenience store or CBD shop having 5 to 10 times more THC than the marijuana edibles at a retailer?
No. I'm strictly talking about serving size. Not serving size, but availability. Serving size should be regulated by OLCC in the same way that it's regulated for the natural THC market. But as far as non-natural derived THC, if it's federally legal, I say you leave it alone and just do what you do with alcohol.
Can I ask a question? Sean McKay with Burnt River Farms. Just to clarify, Stephen, when you're talking about concentration limits of THC 3 to 4 times higher, you're most likely referencing artificially derived cannabinoids, correct?
No, just THC from hemp. So like it could be in a full spectrum product, but like when somebody's making CBD isolate, they separate the THC out of the raw hemp extract and then put that into a gummy or a caramel or some type of product at a concentration of 0.3%. But because that 0.3% scales by weight, that means that an 80-gram chocolate bar could have 240 milligrams of THC and still be a legal hemp edible.
So it seems rather than concentration limits, we need to focus a lot on milligrams maybe per unit rather than milligrams per weight. And, this is really concerning that I realize it's necessary that we have to have this conversation, but if we look at the current state of the OLCC market and where a lot of the product stability is within these companies, I don't think that by allowing more THC into an unregulated market is going to benefit any of our companies in any way. And that's just my personal opinion.
For another opinion, this is Tim Fitzpatrick at Curaleaf. Any cannabinoid, whether it's comes from hemp or THC or naturally grown cannabis, if it's an intoxicant, THC, Delta 9, 8, 10, then it needs to be regulated by the OLCC. It's an intoxicant, and it's irresponsible to do anything other than that.
Yeah, this is Casey Houlihan here from the Oregon Retailers of Cannabis Association as well. I just wanted to reiterate that point. I think if we're dealing with any product that is being advertised as an intoxicating cannabis product, that should also be subject to those same regulations and limitations, if only for the purpose of public safety.
I would say, to take that one step further, Sean McKay again, Burnt River Farms, you know, even if it's not being marketed as intoxicating, we've seen a lot of these bad actors market as therapeutic. You know, Delta 10 is going to be less cerebral than Delta 8. You know, I mean, you could market this however. We've seen with these artificial cannabinoids that we obviously have to get into the very nitty gritty of the science and the chemistry of this. And so to form rules around marketing language, I think is irresponsible as well. These need to be very defined around specific milligrams and concentration limits per package.
Thanks, Sean. Steve Crowley, OLCC. So just to make sure that we've still got the same focus, we at this point are still just talking about the Delta 9 THC limits. We'll get to the other artificial cannabinoids later. But for THC and products in the general market, I mean, this is where we're talking about the sort of products that you know, Mitra and Anna were discussing, where a full spectrum hemp product may contain some amount of THC, or you know, there may be just THC purified from hemp without other cannabinoids that's put into a product. But just looking for what amount the group thinks should be allowed for sale outside of the OLCC system.
Thanks, Stephen. And just a heads up for everyone, this is about a 5-minute warning until we have to probably move on to the next topic.
Travis Ruthenberg, SC Labs. I'll say it seems insane to me that we would allow more Delta 9 THC in a hemp product than we would allow in a marijuana product. So to me, it seems that we should limit hemp products to the maximum allowed in marijuana products or less, or we should raise the limits on marijuana products to match the hemp products or more.
So can I ask a general question of the group? Do we have any consensus on what an intoxicating amount or an intoxicating milligrams of THC is? Is 1 milligram intoxicating, 2 milligrams intoxicating, 10 milligrams?
Sean, could you just say your name for the record?
Sean McKay, Burnt River Farms.
Any with the wilds, I believe Anna was the one saying that it was a 2.5 milligram threshold for THC to feel any effects, and a high dose of CBD would sort of negate that. In this discussion, I just want to be clear that we aren't talking about CBD or CBN, even though people might consider that intoxicating because it makes you sleepy or it makes your stomach feel better. So we're just only talking about Delta 9 THC currently. The threshold also needs to keep in mind, we use a broad spectrum hemp extract for wild CBD, so it's THC free. And our hemp product line is very popular with that THC free without having to have any THC in it. However, there is some testing limitations on really low per package amounts. If you do allow 1 milligram per package or whatever, it may be difficult for some labs to test for those levels on certain products.
For me, that seems relevant. I mean, when we start talking about, anything more than 2.5 milligrams per package, if we're talking about something that's accessible at the gas station to my 6-year-old kid, I don't want there to be more than, I don't want him consuming 2.5 milligrams of THC. And, so I think that, based on what I've heard, Sean McKay again, Burnt River Farms, I apologize for that. Based on what I've heard today, I think that milligrams per unit of cell is the most relevant way to regulate Delta 9 in hemp products.
Real quick, this is Christine with Bruin. So one of my questions is, how are we actually regulating this in the market? So we're tied into these milligrams what we're doing, but testing is not consistent across the states. So we're looking at products that we're bringing into the Oregon microclimate here. Are we requiring any kind, I mean, like the amount of specificity that we're talking about with the minute amounts of THC with the milligram is, I mean, it is kind of hard to enforce that. And right now there's significantly larger amount of regulation around the marijuana products than there are the hemp products on the open market.
Steve Crowley, OLCC. So I understand that there's probably not the amount of consistency in testing in the hemp market as there is in the marijuana market. That being said, the ODA does currently have rules requiring testing of hemp products. The House Bill 3000, effective January 1, puts some of those requirements into law and clarifies them. There is obviously the issue of enforcement of that, but there at least should be the framework that products are getting tested. And so just to Sean's point, the milligram per package cap, I think, is the important piece, and just what that number should be. I guess I'll open it up one more time here, and then I think we need to move on to the next topic.
This is Anna Simons again. I would just add, in support of what Mitra said about ratios, perhaps you could do a small carve out where the THC limit is a really low number or portion of a milligram, with a carve out for high CBD products where the ratio is greater than 20:1, for example, or higher.
Thanks,
David.
Go ahead.
David Standiford, OLCC. If you're aware of any scientific research supporting that point, that high amounts of CBD would reduce or eliminate that intoxicating effect, that would be really helpful for us. So just after this, if you do have those papers or any sort of research showing that, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, I'll be happy to email you.
All right, so next up on the agenda, we can move on to the artificially derived cannabinoids. This is a large issue that touches a lot of different areas. It touches the general market and the OLCC market. It involves industry interest related to innovation, reputation, and market disruption. It involves consumer interest in novel products, consumer expectations and presumptions of relative safety, and informed choice. And so it's a really complex and difficult issue with no easy answers. But that said, we need to figure out some answers. So all of your input on this is going to be really valuable. For context, we are only talking about artificially derived cannabinoids in products for sale to consumers in Oregon. The manufacturer of artificially derived cannabinoid and the manufacturer of artificially derived cannabinoids at OLCC licensed businesses. Manufacture of Delta-8 and other artificial cannabinoids outside of the OLCC system and intended for sale outside of Oregon is not in the scope of this discussion. That's another subject that we expect will be tackled by the task force that was established by House Bill 3000. So as we approach these issues, we are trying to be mindful of legislative intent. The legislation clearly kept open the possibility of a regulated path for Delta-8 THC products in Oregon, but what exactly that regulated path might look like is an open-ended question. I think it'll be easiest to break this issue down into several discrete questions. So the first question is, which artificially derived cannabinoids should be allowed to be sold? Bear in mind that new substances keep hitting the market. The Delta-8 THC, O-acetate, and hexahydrocannabinol have both just appeared in the last few months. We probably want a rule that puts guardrails around the next new thing without having to anticipate what that next new thing will be. So we're thinking about having an allowable set of artificially derived cannabinoids named specifically in rule, with the ability to add others through future rulemaking if needed. Does anyone have feedback on that approach or thoughts about which specific artificially derived cannabinoids should be allowed? And I guess just one more piece of context. Artificially derived cannabinoids as defined in House Bill 3000 basically means something hemp or marijuana as a starting material and then subject to chemical reaction to turn something from hemp or marijuana into something else.
Annie with the Wild, I am wondering if there is a decision on allowing Delta 8 or Delta 10 THC into a product. Would that be in addition to the 100 milligrams of Delta 9 THC, or would that have to factor into the total 100 milligram THC in like some ratio way?
That is a great question, and we'll tackle that a little bit further on here.
You know, Stephen, I think Sean McKay, Burnt River Farms, I think just as a good starting point, you know, the group should try to identify as many of these cannabinoids artificially or naturally occurring and start to build out some kind of a subset, because like you said, they show up on the scene and then they're out. And some of these things pose a lot of potential health hazard to the consumer. I believe it was the hydrogenated THC has the potential to be almost 300 times stronger than standard THC. And so, you know, if this is combined with the product, or if this shows up in the open market unregulated, you know, there's potential for some bad things to happen here. And I think with, you know, the OLCC now being tasked with the responsibility of managing these, that we have the ability to have a little bit of forethought and lead this and maybe plan rather than react.
Yeah, JT from Sublime here. I would tend to agree. I mean, even with some of the naturally occurring compounds that are in trace amounts, you know, scaling those up and you know, people taking them in at rates that were never naturally occurring presents a potential toxicological issue and problem. So now when we move to the artificial ones, there's even more unknown space here, and it really makes me concerned when, if you know the history of truly synthetic cannabinoids and the dangers there with continuing to produce analog after analog to get around the laws, it produced compounds that nobody's ever taken, nobody's done toxicology studies on. There just isn't that there. It's basically new drug development is what we're talking about here. So I think there's almost, you know, fully synthetic, there's natural or occurring, and then there's somewhere in between, which is these other forms that are being derived from and created from naturally occurring cannabinoids. And CBG, of course, you can derive all kinds of things. There's a precursor beyond that, in front of that, that can be used to do all kinds of things. And it's really a conundrum because we don't want to, you know, squelch innovation, but at the same time, we're talking about people's health and people's lives. And I don't know that there's an easy answer here. For something truly artificially developed, it should probably have to go through some rigorous assessment based on current knowledge and the understanding of biochemistry. But again, who in the industry has the kind of time and money to do that? You're talking about more pharmaceutical type development. So I would look at what's there, knowing that more is coming, but even allowing some of these new ones in, the acetate forms and so forth, does anybody really even know? It's really problematic, and yet everybody's going to cry foul if you say we're just going to keep those out of the market or try, and now they're moving into the black market. Synthetic ones have done. And it's just a huge can of worms. Some kind of toxicological screening, C of A's, I mean, it's not quite of the same level, but you can think of the same thing we went through with other ingredients, terpenes, vaporizing them, and so forth. Those have some track record, but in the amounts that some people happen to put them in products, it's an experiment. So a risk-benefit analysis here is going to be, I think, kind of tricky.
So I was going to propose a question to our guy from SC, but it looks like he just left. Stephen, you may have some input on this, but what's our confidence level of our current testing laboratories that they can even identify and test for these on a regular basis? And are there commercially available standards out there for THC acetate and Delta 8 and all of these things? And Travis, I see you're back on. Maybe you can comment on that.
Sorry, Sean, can you say your name for the record, please?
Sean McKay, Burnt River Farms.
Travis Ruthenberg, SC Labs. I think this is a really difficult issue to try and regulate for all of the reasons that have been mentioned before. As to some of the specifics for some of these compounds, there are certified reference materials available. For some of these compounds, there are materials available without certified reference concentrations. For the laboratories, you know, it's much easier to do a targeted analysis where we know what we're looking for than a non-targeted analysis where we're trying to find and identify unknowns. Certainly, Delta 8 has a number of sources of commercially available certified reference materials available. THC acetate has CRM available. Delta 10 has a CRM available. Hexahydrocannabinol, I do not believe has a CRM available. Things like THCP and CBDP, I think there's a material available, but not with a certified concentration. So, you know, it is a challenge for the lab with new compounds coming onto the market, waiting for reference material providers to be able to offer those. And I won't jump into the bigger challenges for labs, which I think are going to come with your follow-up questions, Stephen. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. This is Steve Jetter with Orlap. I want to jump in here too and tag on to what Travis was just saying, and I totally agree with all of those points. From a laboratory accreditation perspective too, it takes time to bring fully accredited analyses online from both the labs and from the state, and so for that reason, we need to know what is being tested for, what is being requested for testing, and I think that it was smart of the legislature to sort of cast a broad net for this definition of intoxicating cannabinoids. But from a practical standpoint, and here at the rule level, we clearly need to define those testing parameters in order to have, you know, valid results to compare.
Sean McKay, can I ask a quick question of Travis? With those commercially available reference materials, do you think that if you were to see a sample, say a gummy that had concentration limits of both Delta 8 and Delta 10, or, you know, maybe a combination of all three, Delta 8, Delta 9, and Delta 10, do you feel that those peaks are distinguishable enough that you'll be able to give accurate reports for each one of those cannabinoids contained within one sample?
Travis Ruthenberg, SC Labs. That's a great question. I think those specific compounds, Delta 8, Delta 9, Delta 10, that's something that's achievable for the labs. I think that not every lab in the current method they're running likely can do that, but I do think that's something that is readily within the realm of possibility for the laboratories. One thing I'll mention is that we see in high Delta 8 products, which we, like everyone else, assume are artificially derived. We see a lot of Delta 8. We see trace Delta 9. And then we see other peaks that we're unable to identify, peaks that we don't have certified reference materials available for, peaks with similar retention times on cannabinoid methods to Delta 8 and Delta 9 THC, things with similar UV-Vis spectra to Delta 8 and Delta 9 THC. So we're looking into those where we can as a lab, but even if we're able to identify those compounds, the likelihood that there's a reference material available and that we could quantify them in a way that would make Stephen at Orlap happy to see done is not something that's going to be readily achievable until we have commercially available standards. One other point I'd mention is, as has been mentioned, this is a terribly difficult question to try and regulate. So I wonder if it would be helpful to frame it as, what reason do we have to allow a cannabinoid, and any reason that we would propose for allowing Delta 8 or THC O-acetate or any of these other compounds? Do we have those same reasons to allow the naturally occurring cannabinoids we see in appreciable quantities already? So could we apply the same reasoning and say that for those same reasons, Delta 9 THC should be allowed or CBN should be allowed? I don't think that's probably going to give us an answer that we can put into the regulations, but it might be worth thinking about that perspective. Thank you.
JT from Sublime here. I would definitely agree with Travis. I mean, off the top of my head, a starting point, because we tend to have starting points in the rules. At this point, I think a very cogent argument could be made that anything that is artificially derived or created from a naturally occurring compound might be a place to allow room. And anything that's truly artificial and not found naturally occurring in any amounts in the plant, those need to be wrestled with in a very different way. And you might want to make a separation between those two. We do know that Delta 8, given it being in the field and how closely it is related as an analog to Delta 9, that it probably has a reasonable safety profile. And if it were going to be allowed, then we might have to start talking about, residues in those extracts. On the hemp side, from what I hear, it's, 60 to 70%. So you have quite a bit of headspace, and it may be some of these other peaks that are showing up that we don't have reference materials for. I know in-house here, we have methodology to convert Delta 9 in a very clean way to Delta 8 with a very, very high efficiency. But I know it's cheaper to do it from CBD from hemp. So if it were going to be allowed, now we have to start talking about what are standard methodologies for doing it, therefore what trace impurities or not so trace impurities would we need to be testing for, just like we do with solvent residues and pesticide residues moving forward out onto the market. And believe me, I am not a proponent for stacking all kinds of new testing and costs on it, but public health is public health and quality products are quality products. But that might be at least a way we could start to get a handle on breaking them out a little bit and then looking at what's important in terms of making them as safe as possible to be brought on the market.
Just quickly, this is sort of a 3-minute warning, so if there's anybody that hasn't had a chance to contribute.
I have a question, and I don't know if this is directed at anybody in particular, but I heard Sean mention hydrogenated THC. And I think it's a valid question because I think it's just a matter of time. We're already seeing hydrogenated CBD, and at some point, somebody is going to bring to market a product that has a higher efficacy or bioavailability than the current oil on the market. How do we handle that? Is that a synthetic? Is that considered synthetic, or would that be a naturally occurring THC product that was then enhanced? And I think you should prepare yourself for that question because it's around the corner.
Annie Rothrock with Wild. Just wanted to, along those same lines, say that if we had a broad spectrum hemp extract, because it contains multiple different cannabinoids in that spectrum, it's not disallowed because it has more than one. You know, if we're going to be narrowing these down to the individual cannabinoids and acetates and variations, if you do have a broad spectrum hemp extract, you want to still be able to test for that as a single product and not get bogged down by the individual cannabinoids within.
I'd like to offer some outside context. Brad Douglas, the workshop. And by outside context, I mean an analogous system. So if this were dietary supplements as regulated in the United States, you would permit any ingredient that's found naturally occurring in that substance. So if you're talking about cannabis, any naturally occurring ingredient thereof, or human metabolites of those compounds. So I would suggest, looking at that context, that you have that bright line rule to start. If it's naturally occurring in cannabis, you consider it as something that can be regulated by OLCC, and then you perhaps then layer on ingredient standards and other testing limits or maybe serving size limits from there. But I think that's a very easy to regulate first bright line rule that has precedent in other regulated areas.
This is TJ with OLCC. I think, Brad, what you just posed is similar to what JT had said. So I guess I have a follow-up maybe for both of you or maybe others as well. But I guess the difference from my perspective with cannabis and other things is that cannabis still isn't that well studied just because of the nature of the product and the historical context, and things are still being discovered. And so who is the determiner of what is in or not in or naturally occurring or not naturally occurring in cannabis?
JT,
My suggestion there, Brad Douglas.
Go ahead, Brad.
All right, I'll take it. Brad Douglas. My suggestion would be, TJ, that you look at the scientific literature. You establish some rule that there's maybe 3 citations in the scientific literature that have found that component naturally occurring in cannabis. But you would have to establish some rule, some definition of how to judge that.
Yeah, JT from Sublime, I'll just follow up. I do know, as you likely do too, there's ongoing studies over the last 20 or so years, starting with El Sole, and now I believe it's up over 1,200 different phytochemicals and components have been documented, generally in more than one place. And a rule like Brad says, you would just like having to come with ingredient information from a manufacturer that you want to bring in, you would have to kind of go through a registration process that says, here's the data. OLCC could have a more permanent growing list of things naturally occurring, and then some of those you might not want to allow, actually. I mean, Taxol, there's a bit of Taxol in cannabis, but we don't want a huge amount of that. So I think there is a good foundation to date that could be mined for the proper data. And I want to emphasize something that Brad said. I was going to bring it back up. The other place, you know, metabolites that we create, I think it's 11-hydroxy that gets created when you eat an edible. That obviously is the active ingredient. It's almost like the THC is a prodrug. So naturally occurring, and look at the natural metabolites in the body, and let's start there, because the rest of the artificials that are truly artificials, God only knows where that goes.
Travis Ruthenberg, SC Labs. I think that Brad's idea and reference are a great place to think about starting. It's, you know, sort of always advantageous to look at other regulations when developing these regulations. I'd just add that for the to address another point that was made, there are a lot of compounds being sold as dietary supplements that we probably know a whole lot less about and have a much shorter track record of safety than THC, for example, and the many cannabinoids. I'd say a lot of the dietary supplements can be as Wild West as what we're talking about now.
TJ with OLCC. So follow-up question to that. I think those are all good ideas. I guess my, I don't know if I call it angst, but my angst is standing up such a program by January and having a layer of safety review involved as well. Because JT, what you're talking about is not just whether or not it's present, but allow it in what levels. That's a lot to ask for. And on the timeline, but also a lot to ask for a non-scientific agency that's not staffed to do such a thing. So I guess, you know, to your earlier question of, you know, consumer safety and is paramount. What is the downside in your mind of setting a smaller frame to begin with, and then having potentially a larger frame later, rather than starting with a larger frame and then trying to winnow it down later?
I'm just going to interject real quickly. We're a little bit over time on this topic, so to be thoughtful to other topics, maybe we let there be a response to that question and then move on to the next topic.
Yeah, JT from Sublime. I agree with you, TJ, and that's why I was trying to say, well, let's at least bring it down to naturally occurring and potentially metabolites. But I see good reason in restricting it a bit more and keeping things out of the market until we do have the proper framework. And having worked with you guys for a couple of years now, I'm very sympathetic to the problem of standing up a program like this.
Can I propose kind of a final thought question? Why wouldn't we, as an agency, just say that any cannabinoid containing product, synthetic or naturally derived, has to first go through the same control study process that we have for producing any other product? And that would, you know, we would be limited by what our state's laboratories could produce, as well as what our ORLAP agency could certify. And, you know, it may not be the cleanest way, but it could allow us to implement some regulation and buy some time and build some more rules on top of it.
Thanks, Sean. I think we should probably move on to the next topic. Stephen, can you kick us off on the next?
Yeah, and actually well, I guess just to Steve Crowley, OLCC, just to respond briefly there. So the control study process just tests homogeneity of THC and CBD. It doesn't get into any other byproducts, any other cannabinoids. So I'm not sure that gives us a framework. But we are at about halfway through the time here, so I think this is a good chance to take our 5-minute break and then come back and launch into some more fun with artificially derived cannabinoids.
So if everyone could try to be back in at about 3:38. Okay, Stephen, I think we can go ahead and get started.
All right. So the next big topic under artificially derived cannabinoids is mitigating the risks of byproducts. And so this was touched on a little bit already. One of the issues with artificially derived or synthetic cannabinoids are that byproducts get generated in the manufacturing process. With cannabis extraction, we're operating in what's essentially a known universe of substances. The extraction solvents are not especially reactive with cannabis. We have testing requirements for residual solvents. So a cannabis extract is composed of substances that occur in cannabis, or maybe some of the thermal decomposition products from low temperatures like THCA turning into THC. By contrast, cannabinoids that are created through chemical reactions also contain the byproducts of those reactions. And what those byproducts are is a really broad question. As we heard from Travis, labs can work with targeted analysis if they're looking for particular byproducts, but for untargeted analysis, if you just have unknown things in the reaction mixture, that's not really practical to require testing to identify those. So our testing rules are built on that targeted analysis for specific known analytes that the labs can get accredited for. So all that being said, we need to identify an appropriate mechanism to make sure consumers aren't unknowingly consuming meaningful quantities of unknown byproducts. So I think the question is, would it be reasonable to require artificially derived cannabinoids to be purified above a certain percentage of purity before they get incorporated into a product? And if so, should the purity level be different between, say, an edible or topical versus a inhalable product? Or is there some alternate means of accomplishing that same objective of mitigating byproduct issues? And just one more piece of context to keep in mind, any specific analyte that gets tested for that impacts rulemaking for other agencies, for OHA to require the appropriate testing and for ORLAP to accredit to that analyte.
Travis Ruthenberg, SC Labs. I think this is going to be another regulatory challenge. Thanks for that background on targeted versus non-targeted analysis. Right now, there is some literature for some of these conversion processes showing specifically what some of the byproducts are. And some of the academic literature on that goes back to the 70s. Anecdotally, it seems that not everyone is using the literature processes to create their products. So I think that it's going to be hard to define a comprehensive list of bad compounds to test for, potentially problematic compounds. As to getting around that by establishing sort of a minimum purity, I don't know that would work. Anecdotally, some delta 8 conversions from CBD are said to produce dioxins, which can be pretty toxic at pretty small levels. So, I think in this realm, there exist the possibilities of certain problematic analytes that you wouldn't capture if you required a derived compound to be 99 or 99.9 or even 99.99% pure. So sorry, I don't have a solution, but just to add to the problem.
Speaking to what I was mentioning earlier, and Stephen, Sean McKay, Burnt River Farms. Speaking to what I was saying earlier about the control study, and Stephen, you had mentioned that right now we only regulate concentration limits and batch size, correct? And so, taking that back to the synthetic cannabinoid itself, and maybe this is what Travis was just speaking about, but why wouldn't we require manufacturers of these products to produce a certified control study for first the synthetic cannabinoid before it can even be used as an input into a product? And that way, if these synthetic cannabinoids are going to make it into our market and be used into some edible product or some other additive, then we at least know that it's been produced with some kind of consistency, I guess.
This is Margaret Florshinger. So the testing rules lie with OHA, and in the testing rules, we need to outline which cannabinoids will be tested for. So we're going through a rec for that right now. And currently we're proposing Delta 9 THC, Delta 9 THCA, Delta 8 THC, CBD, and CBDA. So if we want to be able to test for other cannabinoids so that laboratories can get accredited for those cannabinoids, we would need to know what those are and put them in our rules for testing. And those testing rules do apply to recreational marijuana and medical marijuana.
How can we regulate something we can't test for? Sean McKay.
This is Margaret Flershinger. Are you, which one are you speaking to in particular? Are you asking about Delta 8 or anything else?
Anything that's not the 4 cannabinoids you just listed. We had these experts that said there's up to 120 different phytochemicals that occur in this plant, and you just said that we're talking about regulating 4 of those. It seems like that leaves it pretty wide open for bad actors and unregulated material to make it into our marketplace that we've worked really hard to form and craft up to this point.
Margaret Flershinger. I think that's part of the discussion that we're having here, is to see if there's other artificially derived cannabinoids that we want to have concentration limits for, which in turn also means having testing requirements for. I know that there's other cannabinoids out there. I think we're all aware of that. As far as how that's going to get addressed, that's probably the larger question, probably to all the agencies and to the industry on how that's going to occur. But for determining concentration limits, for labeling, for testing, for laboratories, we're trying to come up with a definitive list of items that I guess can be there and to what extent they could be there.
Sean McKay, so as far as the rule-making framework, what typically comes first in regulation? Concentration limits, testing requirements, identification? I mean, it seems like we should have been down this road before, and one should kind of precede the other.
And Steve Crowley, OLCC. So, I mean, those pieces kind of go hand in hand. We can't have concentration limits on something unless it's being tested for. But by the same token, I don't think it's practical or the industry wants to bear the cost of getting accredited tests for 144 different cannabinoids. So really what this probably isn't the venue to discuss what should be, if anything, should be done about all of the naturally occurring cannabinoids that are in cannabis extracts. That's kind of baked into the marijuana system and the hemp system. Right now, we're really looking at the artificially derived cannabinoids and specifically the byproducts that come out of those reaction processes and what can be done to mitigate those specific risks.
Yeah, JT from Sublime Solutions. I think, because I think of not just the byproducts that can be created, but potential residues of noxious agents, catalysts, and so forth like that. There's a parallel problem, although it hasn't come up in terms of CRC methods and them not being used properly for certain primary extracts. And I think, if we start from, again, where we have with pesticides and solvents, as Travis was saying, there are some precedents in terms of methods out there. They're going to list, what are the agents that are used to do these synthesis, and you can get an idea, and maybe there is some published work also on byproducts that can be created because of those mixes. But just like OLCC has said, here's the list of pesticides. Nothing can be used outside of this, and here's action limits on the ones that are allowable. Solvents the same way. There's only a list that you can use by rule, and then they're tested at certain action limits. again, to start from a reasonable foundation, what are the methods that people use? What are the components of those methods? What are the potential breakdown products? And at least you'd have the ability to begin to craft targeted analysis, at least for initial approval, if not ongoing testing beyond that, in terms of like a control study saying, yes, here's my SOP, I use these catalysts, there's none of them remaining in the final product, it's up at this purity, and we know potential noxious, if there's dioxins that are produced in one of these processes, tested and controlled for that, and they're not there. Easily said, I understand, and then as TJ pointed out, the logistics around the testing labs having to do this and the standards and all, that's the work in the trench. But we might be able to start there, particularly in terms of Delta 8, which right now seems to be the big one.
This is TJ with OLCC. I guess I have a more meta question maybe. Is there a demand for Delta 8 THC, Delta 10 THC, those sorts of things, or is there a market demand for arbitraging the controlled system restrictions and regulations? In other words, is a consumer after Delta 8 THC, or is a consumer after potentially buying products that can exceed concentration limits or whatever else, age limits, those sorts of things?
Sorry, just quickly, before anyone responds to TJ's question, just wanted to give you a 3-minute warning.
I might
JT,
take that one.
Okay, Brad, go ahead.
Brad Douglas, the workshop. I would suggest that isomers of THC, Delta 8, Delta 10, others have different pharmacological activity. So I do believe that not only adult use consumers, but also medical cannabis patients would be looking for the different activity that these other cannabinoids can provide if they knew more about them and they knew that they had a safe supply to get those. And from what I've seen in terms of the history of our adult use cannabis systems, how they were really born out of medical cannabis systems, the ability to have those different cannabinoids available to allow the I guess a more broad spectrum pharmacology of the product is pretty important. So I would say yes, TG. I think that they are, if consumers were aware of them, would be looking for these other cannabinoids, not just to circumvent a serving limit or something of the sort, but just to get different types of effects.
Yeah, JT from Sublime, real quick. We've had the ability to create Delta 8. The current adult market does not seem to be all that interested. I think Brad's right, some of it's education. I think right now the crisis or problem we're facing is that these things were brought out, and not meaning to be pejorative, in the hemp side of the market as a workaround for a market that was getting hit and price compression happening. And these folks, some of them saw a way to get a more attractive product out without it being in the regulated markets. So I think there's a combination there. The Delta 8 that we did test out in the market with actual focus groups was very well received. But I think Brad's point is cogent. If we can get them into the regulated side and have a good framework around them, that will do well. But you're right, TJ, a lot of what we're seeing in the nation right now, just a simple workaround and a money-making thing for a lot of people.
This is Kim London, Oregon Cannabis Association. I'll just say anecdotally, as we were discussing with our members and kind of grappling these issues, there were several people that came out and said that they use it for medicinal purposes, or they have customers who are asking more and more for medicinal purposes. So although, as said before, we would prefer everything run through the regulated market. So I definitely think there is still a need from our customers and our patients to keep these things within a safe regulated market.
This is Casey Houlihan here with the Oregon Retailers of Cannabis Association. I actually just wanted to echo Kim's comment too. That's the one thing that we've heard most consistently from our folks too, is the desire to make sure that this all does get run through a regulated market. And we just want to make sure that any intoxicating compounds are being appropriately regulated and not just sold openly or to people without age restrictions and so on.
Thanks. Steve Crowley, OLCC. I think this is a good time to move to the next topic here, which is where should artificially derived cannabinoids be able to be manufactured and sold? For context, OLCC has the authority to set potency limits on artificially derived cannabinoids in hemp items in the general market outside of the OLCC system, but no other authority to regulate their manufacture. So if these products are allowed to be sold outside of the OLCC licensed marijuana system to consumers in Oregon, we are not aware of any mechanism to check for the purity of the ingredients.
Uh-oh, Stephen, are you there? I think we might have lost you. Oh, we still can't hear you. Oh, lost you again.
So yes, we're not aware of any mechanism. Can you hear me now? Okay. So yeah, if they're being sold to consumers outside of the OLCC system, we're not aware of any mechanism to control for the byproducts or any of those purity issues. Also, an untracked system is more susceptible to falsified lab results, as some recent reporting has explored. So with that in mind, allowing sale to Oregon consumers only at OLCC licensed marijuana retailers seems to provide the most benefit to consumers in terms of being able to know what's gone into their products. And then on the manufacturing side, the options seem to be allow artificially derived cannabinoids, but not finished goods, to be manufactured in the general marketplace and then transferred into the OLCC market, where only OLCC processors could make the finished products for sale to consumers in Oregon, or just only allow manufacture within the OLCC market. And again, remember a couple of pieces. This is specific to cannabinoids created through chemical reactions. It would not apply to any cannabinoid that's simply extracted from the plant. Those would continue to be available for sale outside the OLCC system. And also, none of this applies to the manufacture of items for sale outside of Oregon. That's just outside of the scope of what we're working with here. So I guess, what are the work group's thoughts on this approach of just having the finished goods for sale in the OLCC system? And are there any alternate models for ensuring that consumers can have a reasonable understanding and confidence in what they're purchasing and consuming?
Sean McKay, Burt River Farms. You know, as an operator of an extraction laboratory, and you know, making these concentrate and extract products and also edible products, you know, this really just to have this conversation, it's hard to even think about this without thinking of the quality or consistency of these artificially derived cannabinoids that even us as a licensed retail or, you know, manufacturer would receive. So I think just having good testing framework to support whatever decision we make here, so that, you know, because we're the ones carrying the product liability on this product, and we're all, you know, admitting here that we're on the frontier of new science and new products, and yeah, there's probably a lot of therapeutic benefit there, but there's also, you know, some liability risk with us as retailers, with us as product manufacturers. And so it's just kind of you know, hate to put my operation at risk to try and sell a little more Delta 8.
JT from Sublime here. I think it's a really interesting question, Stephen, because in thinking about you kind of got an overlay. You've got the hemp industry as outside, and right now we can bring material in from them that's, I think it's up to 3 or 5% Delta 9, and we can take that and then bring it into the OLCC market. The question that comes to my mind is that in violation of the Farm Bill? So a hemp processor, can they really transfer something that has more than that 0.3% legally? Now, I know enforcement's an issue there, but I wouldn't want to take away from other good processors just because they're on that side of the line the ability to create something from their biomass, and because in this case it would only be appropriate to put it into the adult use regulated tested market here, transfer it to us. But how would that work in terms of the federal Farm Bill? I don't know. I think allowing these in the adult use market here, absolutely, but not outside it. In terms of manufacture, I think that's an open question because of that. But of course, for finished goods, the OLCC licensees, if they register those products properly, test them properly, they should be allowed to put them into the market.
I'll add something, Stephen. I would agree with you that in the current system where there's a bit of a lack of federal leadership, or perhaps a mandate for federal leadership for manufactured psychotropic products, I don't see a better way to protect the public safety and still permit these compounds other than the system that you outlined.
Sorry, Brad, could you also say your first and last name for the record?
Brad Douglas, The Workshop.
All right, if that's all on that topic, we can move on to the next piece, which is kind of piggybacking on the consumer informed choice as an important part of this framework. So, I mean, not all consumers are aware that Delta 8 THC products are manufactured from CBD. There's also just a real lack of information about the long-term consequences of consuming things like Delta 8 THC, which haven't been commercially manufactured and consumed at scale until recently. So are there requirements for warnings or other labeling requirements that would be appropriate to ensure consumers understand what they are consuming with Delta 8 or other artificially derived cannabinoids?
Annie with Wild, I was going to bring this up if no one else did, but yeah, I do think there should be some visual distinction on the packaging that would inform not only consumers, but also bud tenders, which product they're giving to the customer. The warnings aren't necessarily as prevalent as perhaps another symbol or statement on the front saying it contains artificially derived cannabinoids. And I think that would be really beneficial for everybody in the retail side.
Sean McKay, I have a question for Brad, or I don't see where our other lab guy went, but do we have solid conversion rates for Delta 8, Delta 10, and these other THC cannabinoids, similar like we do for Delta 8 THC, so that we could accurately label these products with what the consumer's getting?
Steve Crowley,
and maybe to be more clear, when I say conversion rate.
Yeah, when you say conversion rate, are you talking about the 877 that the THCA gets multiplied by in that total THC?
Yes, that's correct.
So
Does that apply to the synthetic cannabinoids as well? Is there a similar conversion?
Steve Crowley, OLCC. So that's really a molecular conversion. It's the ratio of the molecular weight of THCA and THC. So it's not pharmacological, which is what you'd be looking at with Delta 8.
This is Steve Jetter with Orlap. Sure. We've also discussed a little bit, just sort of amongst the agencies, if there's even need to test for Delta 8 THCA in the acid form. And our consensus thus far has been that because Delta 8 THC and really any of the other minor isomers occur in such low concentrations, if at all, in the plant material itself, and it's all produced sort of after the fact chemically, that there's not a need to test for the acid form of them and do that conversion that you were talking about. But if anybody has any further information on that, I'm still not 100% convinced that we shouldn't proceed with calculating and then reporting total Delta 8 THC in the same way that we will be reporting total Delta 9 THC. So if anyone in this group has a finger on the pulse of some hotshot plant breeder who's actually getting Delta 8 THC present in plants at the concentration that we would ever detect the acid form, we would love to hear about it.
Brad Douglas, the workshop. Stephen, I would suggest that even though I'm unaware of Delta 8 THCA being produced by the plant, that Delta 8 THC itself seems to be a byproduct of Delta 9 when it occurs on the plant. That might be wise to future-proof the regulations and testing standards to include, because it's likely to happen, even if it doesn't come from a cannabis plant. It could come from a engineered yeast that's producing cannabinoids. If the standard's available, why not?
Steve Jetter again with Orlap. Thanks for that. That's been discussed. I have had a little bit of a hard time sourcing or finding certified reference materials or standards for the acid form that don't require a DEA exemption. They basically don't come in a solution. They come as a neat material, and for a lot of our laboratories, that's not something that they can purchase easily. So, but I might do some further digging, and I kind of agree with you that it might be good to just start from the get-go, looking at total Delta 8 THC or any other of the cannabinoids that we're discussing today.
If it's possible, Brad Douglas. If those Delta 8 THCA standards aren't available, or you need a DEA license, obviously that's a gating point. You can't deal with that. But if possible, I did want to come back to the question you asked, Sean, and that was, I think, is there a way to say there's a good or bad process when dealing with something like a Delta 8 THC conversion? And the one thing I can say is that there are both good and bad processes. And I analogize this to somebody making eggs. You can take very good eggs, and in some person's hands, they make great scrambled eggs. In some person's hands, they make really terrible eggs. I think the same is true if you're making Delta 8 THC from CBD. There can be very clean processes, and there can be very dirty processes, and it's important to distinguish them.
And that's my, Sean McKay, that's my exact concern, Brad. And from the small amount of research that I had done leading up to this call, that seemed to be the biggest concern of mine, was that there are these different processes, which some use more caustic chemicals and things like that. And so the danger the potential danger of the residue can be much higher with other processes than others. And so that goes back to my point about coming up with some type of a control study for, even if it's a hemp processor, I don't see why we can't require a hemp processor to have a control study to produce delta-8 THC.
Brad Douglas again. I think your idea of a control study, I know Stephen had said that a controlled study in Oregon mainly deals with residual solvents and standard testing parameters like that. But the idea, the concept is not unheard of. If you're bringing a pharmaceutical drug to market, you're doing your chemistry manufacturing controls, you're showing the byproducts you produce in your process, and you have to identify those things, identify any other dangerous things that could potentially be in there or unknowns that are in there. That might be part of this process. You identify some of those things that shouldn't be in there, and maybe the onus is on the person bringing that to market, and you basically show why your process is safe and doesn't include these things. And then from there, you can develop an ingredient standard. This also has precedent or analogy in food and dietary supplements, where you not only say there's a minimum purity standard, but there's also a limit on particular impurities. So again, that's something that's been done in other areas that could be useful here.
Thanks. Steve Crowley, OLCC. I think this is a good time to hop to the next subject, still under artificially derived cannabinoids. And JT touched on it briefly earlier, color remediation technology. And so to a large extent, this is kind of a piece with all the other artificially derived cannabinoid issues. Some processors, when they use a color remediation column to remove color from extracts, they may use a reactive stationary phase, like acidified clay in the column, which reacts with cannabinoids and results in the final product containing cannabinoids that do not occur in the cannabis plant. For example, some of these processes generate delta-8 and delta-10 THC. It's unclear what other cannabinoids are generated in this process, but the result is that processors who do that type of color remediation with reactive materials are not entirely sure what they're generating, and so consumers are not aware of what substances they're actually consuming. So with that context and framing, does anyone feel strongly that color remediation with reactive stationary phases should be allowed? And if so, how do you mitigate the issue of unknown byproducts or overcome that unknown set of risks that gets passed along to consumers of those products?
Travis Ruthenberg, SC Labs. I don't have a great answer to the question of whether it ought to be allowed or not, but you know, if it is, we've already talked about the idea of potentially labeling products that contain artificially derived cannabinoids, and it seems like that would apply to this situation.
This is Mitra with Palm Extract. To speak to this issue, I think that having perhaps similar to what was recommended before, where there's like a guide list of pesticides already, perhaps having a guide list of what is allowed to be used for color remediation technology could be a solution for that. And that is what comes to mind. And I also would just like to second or third that idea of having the specific labeling that would be sort of a different product type, similar to the more recent vaping product types that are now standard, and having something like that on just the basic product type, I think would make it very clear to a consumer on that primary display panel exactly what they're getting. Thank you.
Sean McKay, I'd like to ask another question of our lab guys. So if this is currently happening with color remediated products, are you guys seeing unknown peaks on your test results that you're not identifying that are potentially Delta 8, Delta 10 THC? And if we're not quantifying those peaks, are we then putting out products that may actually have more THC in them, albeit synthetic, than what we're legally allowed to produce?
Travis Ruthenberg here, SC Labs. Some of these compounds we measure, like Delta 8, some we don't, like Delta 10. So the answer is in some cases yes, in some cases no. As to sort of total THC, I think that's defined in the regulations. So I think the regulations define total THC, if I'm not wrong, is Delta 9. So to include Delta 8 would be to change that definition in the regulations. It seems like Delta 8 has psychoactive effects, so I could see making the argument to include that in the total. People love bigger THC totals, so I could imagine the entire industry getting behind that.
Just a quick 4-minute warning on this topic.
Brad Douglas, I might offer a suggestion or an answer to your original question, Stephen, and that was how do you regulate processes that produce some of these other cannabinoids that may have a different function like color remediation? And as I was suggesting for other artificial cannabinoids, they have an ingredient standard. My suggestion to close the loop would include having an ingredient standard for, say, a Delta 9 distillate. So in that Delta 9 distillate standard, you could imagine having no higher than or no greater than quantities of Delta 8 or Delta 10. So you could have a maximum allowed concentration of those. Anything above those would make it or disqualify it as a Delta 9 distillate, and then you'd have a non-compliant product. I think that's, from a regulatory standpoint, it's tough to regulate processes that can have dual functions unless you're judging it based on the output.
Yeah, JT, I'm going to follow that question, that comment up. JT from Sublime. My understanding is that most color remediation at this point is being used on primary extracts to get them nice and clear, or almost completely glass clear, and that then you're getting a deposit of these byproducts and potentially other things coming out of the CRC columns. And so, yeah, I think distillate would be an easy one or easier one to handle, as Brad's suggesting. But I think most of the weight of the CRC stuff is really over in those primary extracts with the shatter makers. And their processes are so different than the refined extracts, which we're talking about over on the OHA side, and maybe getting some more sophistication in product typing. But again, as you blow the matrix out further, it just gets more unwieldy. But some level of purity standard for these new things, because like I said, I know our conversion rate from Delta 9, I think, is up over 90%, and most of what's left in the product is Delta 9, along with the bulk of the Delta 8. I don't know what it is on the hemp side. I've heard that generally they're 60 to 70% Delta 8, but what is the rest of it? We don't really know, and I think that needs to be addressed.
Brad Douglas, Steven, sorry. Offer one more thing as an outside reference. The USP monograph for dronabinol, the synthetic THC, is a good reference. It's an ingredient standard, essentially, that defines what impurity levels you can have, defines delta-8 THC allowable, iso-THC allowable, and some other potential byproducts. It's at least a useful kind of format to look at as we contemplate this.
Thanks, Brad. Steve Crowley, OLCC. So the last subtopic under artificially derived cannabinoids, and it's, again, kind of a big one, is potency and concentration limits for artificially derived cannabinoids. And we've kind of touched on this a few times already. So setting aside the issue of which market they belong in, the next question really is, what are appropriate concentration limits for artificially derived cannabinoids? And I guess the question depends somewhat on which cannabinoids are allowed. If we're just talking about delta-8 THC, that's one thing. If we're talking about other things with drastically different potencies, that would kind of change the question. But we have been thinking about basically having a combined allowable total on delta-9 THC plus any impairing artificially derived cannabinoids. So for example, if the limit for edibles is 100 milligrams, a one-to-one product would have 50 milligrams of delta-9, 50 milligrams of delta-8. The reason for that is if the limits are separate, then there might be pressure for manufacturers to produce products that contain the maximum of each. So 100 milligrams delta-9 plus 100 milligrams delta-8, just so that they're making the absolutely most potent product allowed by rule. And while the legislation clearly left a door open for regulated delta-8 products, allowing it to be combined with delta-8 THC to make a more potent product than is otherwise allowed, it seems to create some perverse incentives. So does the group have thoughts on this approach or other ideas for how the content of artificially derived cannabinoids should be regulated? And should artificially derived cannabinoids be able to be combined with naturally derived cannabinoids at all?
You know, based on pretty much everything that we've talked, sorry, Sean, okay. Based on everything we've talked about today, I think it's, you know, we've determined that milligrams per unit of any cannabinoid, whether we're talking artificially or naturally derived, you know, it is what's very important here and should be addressed. And, you know, from there, establish the testing recommendations and decide if it can be combined. But we should first determine, you know, how much of this stuff we're going to allow as a whole, because like you just said, Stephen, you know, the new legislation sets a limit for 100 milligrams, but if there's this backdoor that actually gets, you know, 100 milligrams of delta-9 and 80 milligrams of delta-8 and 10 milligrams of delta-10, you know, then are we doing a disservice to some, you know, some of our good actors that are trying to do right by the industry and follow the rules? It just seems like it leaves it wide open.
Yeah, I'll follow that up. JT from Sublime. When we were formulating prototypes of delta-8, delta-9 products, we always considered that the agency would eventually use the same limits because they're psychoactive. So we have limits for delta-9 or a psychoactive cannabinoid, but there's no limits on CBD because we know that they're not. So you have that issue there. Is it psychoactive or is it not psychoactive? And I think that's a good division point. Then, Stephen, you brought up a very important question, and somebody mentioned it earlier, that some of the newer forms that are starting to show up are quite a bit, whereas delta-8 is 80% as intoxicating, or so it seems, around there. Some of these others are quite a bit more potent, and you wouldn't want to get into a, we'll call it a fentanyl problem, right? Where you've got something so super potent, but it's psychoactive. It can go in and be part of this 1,000 milligram thing. So again, we're starting to see a matrix that is really difficult, not to untie, because how do you classify these new cannabinoids or artificial cannabinoids when they don't have a track record of toxicology, of a dose response curve, or any of those kind of standard things that you would have, say, on a pharmaceutical product. And I don't know what the answer is, but I think starting to define and break them out, and we've already got psychoactive and non-psychoactive, and now, again, to bring one in, do you have to do some screening and show at least initial potency levels in terms of effectiveness, cleanliness in terms of purity, all these questions. It's pretty amazing.
Annie Rothrock with Wild. If we're just talking about adult use marijuana products, I think it should stay within a total THC of 100 and have ratios within. However, medical, as Brad was saying earlier, they are more educated on which of the Delta 9 or THC variants might be helpful for their maladies. And so I don't think there should be a similar cap on the medical side. I think they should be allowed to explore more options for dosing in that sense.
This is Mitra with Elm Extracts. I think it's so complex with the new and emerging cannabinoids and artificial cannabinoids, and because it is such a new piece of the industry, I would err on the side of a more precautionary approach when it comes to especially inhalable products. Until we really know what all solvents are being used and know that the ORLAP standards are going to be testing for all of them with some of these artificial cannabinoids, as was mentioned, it just seems like really untreaded territory, and we certainly all want to err on the side of caution in the wake of what happened with the vape crisis in previous years. So when it comes to inhalables in particular, I would, err more on the side of caution, just based on where the science is at and anecdotally. Thank you.
Sean McCain, just to add a small comment to that, I think there's a lot more risk with the ingestible products with this, especially with the potential higher efficacy rates. It seems like that's where we see most of our, emergency room and bad experiences with people not dosing their edibles, which gives our industry a bad name, and it doesn't have to be that way. And I would hate to see more of those instances happen just because we didn't have a good consumer education product to follow, with these products being added. And it's just, we have a very busy retail store, and the majority of our customers are still very uninformed.
All right, thanks everyone. Steve Crowley, ULCC. So we did it. That was, I think, the most difficult set of questions. That's everything we had on artificial cannabinoids. So at this point, there's just a couple more topics to hit, and I think these are going to be lighter, easier ones. So the next one on the agenda here is hemp vapor items. We haven't talked much about it yet, but Senate Bill 96 gives OLCC the authority to regulate labeling of hemp vapor items sold in Oregon, and requires that these hemp vapor items be tested according to the marijuana testing rules. We are thinking of essentially replicating the requirements that we established for the inhalable cannabinoid products in the OLCC system, which is basically require label pre-approval, including disclosure of the ingredients to consumers, and require that the manufacturer of any non-cannabis additive provides a statement that the additive is intended for use in a product for human inhalation. hemp items in the general market would still continue to be limited to 0.3% THC. So a 1 gram hemp vape outside the OLCC system would continue to be limited to no more than 3 milligrams of THC. But in terms of the non-cannabis additive piece, any feedback on this approach or thoughts on areas where we need to adjust our
JT from Sublime Solutions. I would say that's absolutely the way to go. I think the rule we came up with last year is good. I think the consumers have the right to know. The agency has the right to also know so that they can properly triage and you know, be aware of what's going on there. I think that could be said of any, you know, potentially problematic product, but I would be 100% in favor of the same regime for pesticides, for solvents, for any other ingredients that are in there, that people have the ability to be aware of what's there, and the industry the ability to regulate that.
Sean McKay, quick question. For the purpose of this conversation, are artificially derived cannabinoids considered an additive?
Probably not. I think they would be, I mean, they're a cannabis material, so they'd be kind of subject to whatever solutions we come up with in terms of rulemaking. It sounded like the consensus was leaning towards those types of products with artificially derived cannabinoids being exclusive within the OLCC system, because that affords more consumer information and assurance. But if artificially derived cannabinoids were allowed outside the OLCC system, I don't think those would fall into the non-cannabis additive category. Any other feedback on testing and labeling of hemp vape items? All right, and we are on to the last item on our agenda, which is hemp items flowing out of the OLCC system. So Section 31 of House Bill 3000 allows OLCC licensed processors to transfer hemp items out of the metric tract system to non-licensees. Historically, hemp entering the OLCC system was a one-way street, which presented difficulty for returns and for businesses that wanted to operate hemp and marijuana operations from a single facility. This change will allow OLCC licensed processors to manufacture hemp items and then transfer them out for sale on the general market. The bill suggests that OLCC set a period of time that the products be held on site after the manifest is generated, but prior to transfer from the licensed premises. And so our main questions on this topic are, we're thinking that any items leaving the tract system should have relevant potency testing demonstrating that they're below the thresholds that can legally be sold to consumers on the general market in Oregon. And this is partly because non-OLCC operators like Oregon-based CBD stores or convenience stores are likely to assume if they're receiving a product directly from an OLCC licensed processor, that product is eligible for sale in Oregon. Does the group have any thoughts on that or any other feedback? Yeah, and I'll leave that there.
Annie Rothrock with Wild. What would the difference be between product coming from hemp handlers and then the products coming from the OLCC?
So, I mean, the hemp handlers are just the primary processors of hemp in Oregon. So they receive raw hemp and do maybe the initial extraction on it. Many of the manufacturers of finished goods, consumer ready goods, are not necessarily registered as hemp handlers. If they're just purchasing hemp extract or CBD isolate or something like that and incorporating it into a product, those are not subject to any, they don't need a registration or license with ODA other than a kitchen license if they're making an edible product. So whereas the OLCC licensed processors are, I mean, it's an Oregon-based system, but I mean, if there are arguments for allowing other things to be transferred out, I mean, that's what we're here to hear and listen to.
JT from Sublime. So just a question for clarification, Stephen, because this has stymied some business that we could have had because it's a locked system once it comes into OLCC. That's the way we have it now. When you talk about being able to transfer back out into the general market, are you speaking just to the Oregon market, or like other hemp product providers, they could go anywhere because the whole nation at this point is open to receiving hemp products as defined as such from anywhere? So I could be doing those products under this new regime and say sending some to Washington or California if the brand that came to me for manufacturing had those markets and these were under the limits and were now considered hemp products. Is that what I'm hearing?
Steve Crowley, OLCC. Yeah, so that is potentially within the scope of the transfer out. As I recall, the language basically just opens it up to processors transferring to non-licensees. I don't think it's especially prescriptive there. So yeah, the scope is, I think, open to discussion.
I have a short follow-up to that. Does it, apologies, Sean McKay, I'll be quick. Does that allow us as processors and product manufacturers to make retail ready products and sell them directly to national retailers, other brands, whatever that may be?
Steve Crowley, OLCC. Right, that's what we're discussing. And then Mitra.
Thank you, Mitra Sticklin with Extract. I just wanted to ask a question of clarification around the types of products that this would include. Like currently, for example, an OLCC processor that has like the processor license and then the reciprocity certificate between like a ODA to OLCC cannot transfer flower and then be transferred back out of the OLCC processor, for example, like hemp flower. So would this only be for hemp extracts, and or what kinds of hemp products would be included in this?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're trying to gather feedback on. One kind of piece to think about with the flower is we allow flower with up to 1% total THC to come into the OLCC system. Oregon law allows hemp that exceeds that 0.3% limit to potentially come into the OLCC system in accordance with the rules that we've established around it. But I don't think we would be contemplating allowing 1% THC hemp flower to go back out until or unless that becomes a federally legal thing to do.
This is TJ with OLCC. Just for those of you in the meeting, I pasted the language of the relevant section into the chat that we're talking about. So, as Stephen has said, it's sort of broad. And that's the basis of discussion to fill in the details in rule. But one thing I just point out is that this is only eligible for things that are industrial hemp products, which means that it has to be derived from industrial hemp. So that as an example, if an OLCC producer produces cannabis that is less than 0.3%, that is still marijuana because it's been produced in the OLCC system. So this isn't about just the strict THC or CBD level. This is about the source and provenance of the material. So it would come in as hemp, be converted into something by an OLCC processor, and then under this be eligible to be transferred back out. And that's what we're talking about here, is sort of the parameters around the parameters that would govern that transferring back out.
Thank you so much for the clarification. This is Mitra Sticklin again with Ohm Extracts. I'm definitely in support of this, and I believe that it will help provide a lot more of those same assurances of someone who is able to walk into an OLCC retailer or receive a delivery from an OLCC retailer who's purchasing hemp products to be able to get those below 0.3% open market type hemp products. And as was mentioned before, that they wouldn't just be locked in terms of those sales opportunities to other wholesalers that then would be able to get it to the end use consumer with a lot more of those quality assurances in comparison to a lot of what is available right now on the open hemp market. While there are so many examples of companies that are providing those assurances of quality and the testing, they're just the facilities are not being inspected and held to the same standards at the same pace as the OLCC programs. So I believe that it will allow for consumers to have that extra layer of quality assurance with a really world-class product. So we're definitely in support of this, and thank you.
This is Tyler Bechtel with the Oregon State Police. If I can, just food for thought, when you're talking about transferring hemp products out, and that means that you can transfer them out to national retailers or anything. Just for the industry to think about, there have been bad actors, and there will be no way for a criminal prosecution to occur on an export of a hemp extract. So you won't be able to differentiate if you've got a processor who's maybe taking a THC product and exporting it out of the state versus a processor who's exporting a hemp extract. Mostly when we do illicit market cases with those extracts, we also have the raw material and we have a way to prove a case beyond just the final product. There's not a crime lab in the state of Oregon that can differentiate between the source of an extract product. So just food for thought there.
This is Tim Fitzpatrick with Curaleaf. I have a question. As we begin to explore all this, how is the administrative cost and burden of overseeing this and managing these activities of hemp products flowing through? Who's going to pay for all that? I mean, everybody here is, a licensee, and they pay fees and taxes to operate our businesses. What's the structure for equally, for lack of a better term, burdening the hemp processors and producers similarly with those that are dealing strictly with cannabis?
Steve Crowley, OLCC. So it's a bit outside of our scope of what we at the OLCC are looking at, but House Bill 3000 did have some language about ODA establishing some sort of tracking for hemp products. What that looks like, I think, is still to be determined, but I don't know that we're going to really see analogous systems between a federally illegal commodity and a federally legal commodity. I think that's probably more of a long-term harmonization rather than anything that we're going to see in the immediate term.
And this is TJ with OLCC. I just also add that the task force in HB 3000 has that question, not phrased exactly the way you said it, but basically the sort of regulation of cannabis writ large in Oregon. That question is part of the remit of the task force. So that lands squarely in that area for recommendations to the legislature more broadly.
Sure. And the idea is we want to make sure that we don't we have one burden on the THC cannabis derived businesses and a different burden or lack of thereof on another intoxicant product. And I feel that's a salient issue for anybody that's operating in this space. We're immediately putting ourselves at a disadvantage. That's all. Thanks.
Annie Rothrock with Wild. I just want to confirm that this is a new alternative, not something that's going to be replacing current practices. So ODA processors are still going to be able to transfer to OLCC and still transfer to open market. This is just an option for people to take advantage of if they can't find an ODA processor or hemp handler to do this.
Steve Crowley, OLCC, yes, that's exactly right. It leaves all of the existing framework for the hemp handler certificates to transfer into the OLCC system. That's still in place. It just adds an extra option to allow an avenue for hemp to come out.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for confirming that. Also, when it comes to the testing and everything, there is still that level of FDA for product that's in the open market. You know, there are some limits on what can be in product if it's going to be in the open market. So it's not all just a free for all.
This is Mitra Stiflin with Extracts again. I'm curious with these new kinds of transfers, if that would also, you mentioned a manifest specifically, so would this all be through like the external transfer function of metric, or envisioning a different way, like for example, transferring to another licensee in another state? There are a lot of other states that are on the metric system and may be interested in receiving items directly through metric, not through the external transfer function, but just directly as a transfer on metric. And I don't know if there might be possibilities for that, but just putting it out there that a lot of other states are also using the Franwell metric system, like I believe almost all of them.
This is TJ with OLCC. I mean, I think in the immediate term, it'll, for January, right, is the timeline we're talking about. Then we're talking about external transfers being sent out where, it's the inverse basically of what happens now. Right now, when you accept something in, for those of you who have done it, it would be configured so that you have to declare the destination, but that destination is not in metric. But I do think that there are discussions and interest of what you're talking about, of sort of cross-state, semi-closed loop aspects to a system like metric. So, in the immediate term, it would be external transfers. Over the medium or longer term, it could evolve into something like what you're describing.
All right. With that,
is this anticipated? Sorry, Sean McKay. Is this rule to go into effect January 1st as well? Has this already been passed?
Yes, this was in House Bill 3000, in the effective or operative date for this provision is January 1. So that's our goal in terms of a timeline for implementing a rule on it.
And one other follow-up question, just for the record, this is Sean McKay with Burnt River Farms. Will these products be required, will they have labeling requirements for them going out for products being transferred outside of the OLCC system?
Steve Crowley, OLCC. I mean, if there's a reason for that, we could certainly entertain that, but considering that I'm not aware of any really clear labeling requirements on hemp outside of the OLCC system. And I don't believe, I think that would probably stretch what we are able to do. So my unless there's a good reason to look at that, I wouldn't think so.
So sorry, Sean McKay, one other follow-up question. Will there be, I believe it was Mia was just talking about the external transfer or something like that. Will the OLCC be tracking units leaving the system? Are we going to be required to report, 1,000 units of gummies left our system? Or is that what we're kind of trying to proceed right now?
Steve Crowley, OLCC. So yes, I mean, as usual, all inventory activity, cannabis inventory activity, needs to be tracked in metric, and so the piece of that that the bill kind of suggests that OLCC establish a time frame that the items need to be held on site before they get transferred out, and so maybe that's 48 hours, but that does provide a window for, if an inspector wants to go out and spot check that the items that are being transferred out are the ones that have been declared. But yes, the inventory tracking remains a kind of key component of cannabis regulation at the licensed premises.
This is Mitra Sticklin with Extracts. I would advocate for these kinds of transfers that having for any sort of like bulk item transfers or not intended for retail or for direct to consumer sales, that there wouldn't need to be label requirements similar to, within the OLCC for marijuana items. And also similarly, I would advocate that it would be a great idea to have rules also that for items that are intended to be sold direct to consumer or for retail, that it basically has the same labeling requirements as the existing hemp items within the OLCC, just so that there's that, again, layer of quality assurance for end use customers, and they know that this is the test results and here's how they can reference it, the same kind of requirements for retail ready packaging that are already existing for hemp items in the OLCC. Thank you.
Annie Rothrock with Wild. Sorry, Mitra, are you saying that you want the little hemp symbol to be on the product that's going from the OLCC out to the open market?
No, not all of the features of it, but I mean, in regards to the types of warnings and the types of listing about the test information, the primary display panel has certain things. I don't think that the same hemp symbol makes sense because every state has their own hemp symbol at this point. There's not a national program or a national hemp symbol yet. So I definitely am not advocating for any of the specifics of the look or the graphics on it, but just for more just having a set of standards, not identical necessarily, but that you could use the existing ones as a springboard to make what would make sense for sales in this way through these external transfers. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, Annie Rothrock with Wild. I agree that there should be some labeling aspects to the product coming from OLCC to the open market for that added assurance of where the products come from. But I do not think that the same blue hemp symbol should be used because that's specific to OLCC dispensaries carrying the hemp product, and it would be confusing if it was an open market as well. I feel.
This is TJ with OLCC. Just to follow up on those two on the pieces from Mitra and Annie. So given like Annie asked previously, there's going to be two streams into the general market under this. There'd be the existing stream that's under ODA exclusively and not under OLCC, and then there's going to be this one that's gated out of the OLCC into the general market. So what are some of the key features that would be beneficial that would not cause confusion for consumers of what would be in the general market related to its provenance from one of those two streams?
Annie Rothrock from Wild. Our product meets, FDA standards and QR. We have QR codes. We have all the things that multiple states have established as proper labeling for hemp items in their regulatory systems. And I think Mitra was suggesting that there's an additional level of testing from OLCC into the open market, and either way, the packaging and labeling, I think, is still up to par for open market product. It's just not specifically regulated by the OLCC. We don't want the burden of the national marketplace to be established, like on product going from the OLCC into the open market, but it's nothing new, really. And it's just I think Mitra just wants an additional level of confirmation for customers that maybe there's a higher standard of testing since this product came out of the OLCC market, as opposed to just FDA required testing and hemp farm bill.
Holly Huckel here. I feel like we should follow the ODA packaging guidelines versus the OLCC to remain consistent with an ODA product. And we should also follow the same guidelines and standards as the ODA hemp products.
Okay, if there isn't any more on that, we'll move to wrapping this up. But before we do, it seems like there have been a few members here who haven't had a chance to offer up any feedback. So want to offer a quick minute if you haven't heard from you, if there's anything you want to make sure that we hear. Okay. And then also to our public health and safety partners and also our other agency partners, if there's anything they want to make sure that we hear as well.
Hey everybody, it's Courtney Moran with the Oregon Industrial Hemp Farmers Association. I just have a few overall comments from the discussion today. Our members, I want to start off with, share all the concerns that have been expressed today, especially those regarding consumer safety and ensuring that consumers are informed about what they are purchasing. We think it's very important and acknowledge that has been an issue, especially in regards to enforcement of the rules that are currently in place. One of the pieces that we discussed today was about hemp processing, and I just want to note that we worked really hard in session to ensure that hemp processing and production of hemp derivatives remains under ODA, and that is what was provided for in House Bill 3000. And so I appreciate your clarification, Stephen, on where that authority ends for what authority has been given now to OLCC, specifically in regards to concentration limits. Now regarding end products, we do already have testing requirements for hemp-derived end products that are sold in Oregon, regardless if they are sold in the retail dispensaries or if they're just sold in the general market. And again, there has been an issue with enforcement, and we agree that there needs to be better enforcement of these existing requirements. And we do expect to see more enforcement, as Stephen mentioned, with the new ODA tracking requirements that are required in House Bill 3000. And consistent with Section 32 of House Bill 3000, the hemp industry is interested in having both pathways open. You know, we want to ensure that there is both an avenue in the general market for these different types of products, as well as the avenue in the retail dispensary market, as we currently have with the hemp certificate program. So for us, that means that lower concentrations of both the naturally occurring as well as artificially derived cannabinoids could be available in the general market, but with, again, concentration limits that require labeling and age requirements. And then, of course, higher concentrated products would only be available in the retail dispensaries. Something else that was also mentioned is that what total THC or what the THC concentration limit is going to be in regards to overall compliance testing. And I just want to make sure that when the rules are drafted, that they are very clear on what tetrahydrocannabinols or what other cannabinoids, if any, and I say if any just because of the discussions in regards to ratios, are going to be included in determining the concentrations to meet compliance. There's still confusion out there in the general market when we're talking about Delta 9. Is it truly Delta 9? Is it also THCA? Of course, you know, we're talking about policy here in Oregon, but we have to look at what are other states doing, as some states are still looking solely to Delta 9, and some states are referring to Delta 9, but really meaning total THC and including THCA within that. So I just want to make sure that these rules are very clear so that question is not lingering, at least in regards to our rules and our compliance. My members will follow up with some specific recommendations on concentration limits for delineating what we would like to see available in the general market versus those that should be limited to the retail dispensaries, in addition to labeling requirements, minimum purity suggestions, and a few of the other topics discussed today. But I just want to thank you, OLCC, for putting this work group together and for bringing everybody together to have this open dialogue today. So thank you.
Thanks, Courtney. Madeline with the OLCC. If there aren't any other comments, we'll go ahead and just wrap up. So on behalf of the OLCC, we want to thank you and thank all the panelists here today for providing their expertise on these issues and for taking the time to help us. We will be looking at drafting rule language in the coming weeks, and we'll be giving notice for further rules advisory committee meetings, public hearings, and open comment periods. If you want any more information about rulemaking or what the path forward looks like for us, just go ahead and email us at olcc.rulemaking@oregon.gov. So thanks everyone again, and have a nice evening.